which oh yes, recording. And I was also noting that my drinking water comes from Sauk Nation from the Souk Lake Reservoir. I'm very honored and privileged to work as BC's Deputy Provincial Health Officer for Indigenous Health and to be a co-PI on the Unlearning and Undoing Systemic White Supremacy and Indigenous Specific Racism Lab with Dr. Kate Youngblood, who's not here today with us, but certainly has been a contributor to this work. And we're really thrilled that we were invited to share a little bit more about the rationale and the how you might tackle those questions 11 and 12, the new questions on the Research Week abstract forms. I'm cisgendered, straight, she, her, and I think that's it for my intro. I'm joined today by my really wonderful and highly esteemed colleagues, Kirsten and Nicole. So I'll pass it over to them to introduce themselves.
I'll go next, Nicole, and then you can just jump right into the intros, maybe. Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten Pyre. I'm calling in today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Comox First Nation. I am the research coordinator for the UNU lab at the moment, and I'm also a registered nurse. Um, and yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Nicole, and you can take it away.
Waid go chuaigh Brasquas Nicole Jules. I'm Sequang and Itlakokmuk. I am gratefully calling in today from my own home territory in Castelnach, which is in Sequamk, otherwise known as Adams Lake, and a cisgendered person who uses she, her pronouns, and I am a Master's of Public Health student doing my practicum with the UNU lab this summer. And I'm very grateful to be here. And yeah, that's me. So I will just jump into our first slide. So we'll begin by acknowledging the inherent rights and title of First Nations in what's now known as British Columbia. First Nations territory stretched every inch of this province. Inherent rights rooted in connection to lands and waters have never been ceded or surrendered. Long-standing Indigenous laws and systems are integrally tied to the lands and waters of these territories, and inherent rights are upheld in international, national, and provincial law. And BC First Nations, as well as other Indigenous people from elsewhere in Canada, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations who now live in BC have inherent rights to health and wellness. And here are some examples on the slide of colonial and settler obligations under international, national, and provincial law to change how we have been doing things. Another key part of our acknowledgement now always includes this slide on the EAT, the truth of the toxic drug poisoning emergency that impacts First Nations peoples in BC at a drastically higher rate than settler populations, leading to the heartbreaking decrease in life expectancy that has been reported by FNHA. And now I will pass it over to Kristen.
So, a lot of you on the call maybe have heard these three task core practices or the three frameworks that we return to over and over again as part of our UNU lab work. So the first is from Puglas Jody Wilson-Raybould from Wewakai Nation, and this is her True Reconciliation Framework, and that asks us to learn, understand, and act. We also use Dr. Kamara Jones, who is the former president of the American Public Health Association, and she has shared her science and practice of anti-racism framework, and that outlines three tasks that align closely with kind of this truth reconciliation framework, which is naming racism, asking how it's operating here, and then organizing and strategizing to act. And then we represent them in this circle because they are not linear, and we ourselves move iteratively through these three tasks over and over again. And this kind of relates to the work that we'll be chatting with you about today as well. And we've also begun to implement these, try to systematically implement the BC Ministers Advisory Council on Indigenous Women's Gender-Based Analysis Plus Toolkit, and that outlines 7 principles for us to move towards health equity for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer people. So these are our foundational obligations for Indigenous peoples. We have 4 columns here on this slide. So we've received hundreds of very specific instructions on how to do this work, and many of these foundational obligations relate to the health system And they come from reports like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Those are the calls to action, the MMIWG, 2S LGBTQIA plus calls for justice, and the in plain sight recommendations, the BC Cultural Safety and Humility Standard, and that's just to name a few that we have here in BCDUs. So as we look at the why, what, and how columns, we can see that all of the work so far has been done by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and our work as the settler health system is kind of in this last pink column under action. And this has to do with the implementation of these instructions and asking, in my sphere of influence, how are we upholding or undermining these commitments? And then again, this is kind of what we're asking us to all consider in these new Research Week questions. And then lastly, here on my section, we've got, so to start this work, we always need to make sure that we are grounded in the directions that Indigenous people have already given us. And we often hear in this work that people kind of get stuck on this need for community consultation, engagement, kind of not sure how to move forward without that. But the truth is that Indigenous voices have rung loud and clear with these foundational directions about how we can move towards reconciliation through taking action. And it's always important to remember that these Indigenous voices are all community members from across what we now call Canada. Um, and that these tests or that the TRC and the murdered and missing or MMIWG 2S plus reports came out because of the testimonies of the survivors and their families here in Canada. Um, so again, collective Indigenous voices have told us what we need to do kind of time and again, and we need to now do our part to uphold these. So under the left side, I guess, the federal ones, we have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. We have the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, which a lot of us, I'm sure, are aware of. The Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus Calls for Justice. We have our UNDRIP action plan for Canada. We have Joyce's principle. And then in specific to us in BC, we have these draft principles that guide BC's relationship with Indigenous peoples. We have the grandmother perspective around data. We have in plain sight, etc. And then I think I'll pass it over to Danielle to discuss those in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. So as we were reflecting on, preparing for the open house and trying to anticipate what some of your questions might be, it occurred to us that there probably is just this foundational question of why. Why are we changing, or why are you changing the process? Why are you including these two questions? And it really does have to do with that action column pillar that Kirsten highlighted, that we really need to become quite disciplined about weaving in this anti-racist work and upholding the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples in our day-to-day work and in every aspect, because we know that systemic white supremacy and Indigenous specific racism is so deeply woven into our processes and our status quo way of working that we need to be quite disciplined about taking that everyday attention to it. And so one of the things that we did when we picked up this stream of work in the Office of the PHO back in 2021 is that we recognize that those check marks exist, that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have done a tremendous amount of heavy lifting to provide us directions and a path for how to move forward as settler healthcare organizations and as people working in and on behalf of those organizations. And so we wanted to start with a bit of a baseline to understand what is the level of awareness even within our team, all the way up to engaging with these foundational obligations. So we've done a series of self-assessment surveys that include both some quantitative and qualitative data collection in our office over the last 4 years. I'll note that, of course, people know that self-assessment isn't a particularly rigorous or robust methodology. And it's really important for us that we are action-oriented in this work. So we're always trying to learn just enough. So thinking back to those frameworks of learning and understanding, we're constantly trying to learn just enough, understand just enough to get us to an act that will then get us back and create that ongoing momentum in that circular learning. So Kristen will go to the next slide and we'll show you what we found and why we think that it's so important to include these questions in the Research Week abstract submissions is because in our team, and as we've taken this survey into other teams and into other presentation venues, we inevitably come up with this finding, which is a variable knowledge across team members across the various foundational obligations. And so we realize that we have work to do to even set the floor expectation in terms of people at least having heard of, for example, in plain sight. That was a pretty shocking finding to us as an office that is literally housed in the Ministry of Health, to have team members that hadn't even heard of in plain sight, which is, as we know, quite an important milestone findings for the BC healthcare system. And so weaving these questions into Research Week really does create an opportunity then to start to level set and to build a sturdier foundation upon which to uphold foundational obligations. Next slide, and it's going to be a surprise to me whether or not it's one. Yes, this is one that I'm still speaking to. So one of the things that came out in our qualitative findings with that survey and the data that we collected is that there's quite a high level of commitment across our team to be a part of upholding inherent rights and to be a part of advancing true reconciliation. And even though we've said there are hundreds and thousands of very specific directions that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have given us across those documentations, in our team, there was still this desire and a need for even more clear guidance about what does that mean for me as a data analyst? What does it mean for me as a report writer? What does it mean for me as an administrative clerk? And so as part of our response to the survey findings, we created an essential training series on foundational obligations. So over a series of sessions, 2-hour-long sessions, we acquainted everybody and gave everybody a high-level overview of what was included in those documents. And then together we co-created this list. We went through and we read the calls for action, we read the calls for justice. We read the in plain sight recommendations, UNDRIP, and the DRIPA action plan. And then we pulled out the ones that are most directly related to the work that we do here at the Office of the PHO. And so as you can see, they're grouped along these 6 themes. We were very grateful that Brianna Bear, Lekwungen and Kwakiutl artist, agreed to help us organize them and bring them to life with this artwork. And so one of the actions that we've taken now, or that I've taken and other team members have taken, is to actually use this image as our screensaver, so that again, as part of our day-to-day work, we have these reminders that we need to ground everything we do and tie it to these various themes. I think I may be passing it. Oh, no, I'm still going. Okay, one more maybe. Again, hundreds and hundreds of directions can be overwhelming and can be hard for people to even know where to start. And so one of the tools that we developed was this instructions have been provided tool. So this is quite simply an Excel sheet that has all of those hundreds of directions that have been given across those various foundational obligation documents. And so this is a quick reference tool that we go to regularly, and we will quite simply do a Control F protocol. So depending whether the topic is on housing, whether it's on intimate partner violence, whether it's related to climate justice, toxic drug substance use. We will type in whatever the topic is that we are working on, and that will quickly bring us to where in those different documents First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have already provided guidance and direction about the way we should be approaching that topic. So I would imagine that this is something, as you're working on your research week abstracts, you can be thinking about, well, what is the main topic of the research that we're engaging with, and then do that Control F protocol, and that will take you to the specific numbered calls for action, DRIPA action plan items that relate to the work that you're already busy with. And now I'm going to pass it to Kirsten, I think. Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Danielle. And also to add too is sometimes I do use this. It's like an imperfect spreadsheet because I don't always find like the word that I'm looking for, but I think it does take a little bit of going through sometimes just to familiarize yourself. So if you don't find your word, don't give up. There's something in there for you. And then this is just before we get into discussing your ideas, this is just a really concrete example of what we did during our OPHO COVID-19 360 review, where we kind of looked back at the COVID-19 response through the lens of Indigenous inherent rights, truth and reconciliation. So using this process that Danielle spoke about just now is we identified these two, the first, our recommendation 15 and action 4.14 were two foundational obligations that were very specific to COVID-19. So the In Plain Sight Recommendation 15 calls for the development of a robust Indigenous pandemic planning structure that addresses the jurisdictional issues that arose in the context of COVID-19, while the BC DRIPA Action Plan 4.14 calls for an increase in resources for Indigenous partners directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic planning and response. And then kind of the deeper we got into this work from the materials that we reviewed and identified and reviewed, we also found that In Plain Sight number 16 that's also we also had a responsibility to that, as it calls for the BC government to implement immediate measures to respond to the MMIWG 2S Plus calls for justice, and then the specific experiences and the needs of Indigenous women as outlined in our COVID-19 review. So a way that we kind of understood this is kind of coming from these foundational obligations is, what do we at the OPHO need to do more of, and what do we need to do less of in order to walk with First Nations governing bodies, MNBC, First Nations Health Authority, and developing a robust Indigenous pandemic planning response. So that was the way that we used these three specific foundational obligations. And I think that is what these questions are getting at for you to consider in your work. So then
May
now,
I jump in, Kirsten?
yeah,
Because I just
yeah.
have a couple of thoughts that just came up for me. One is that we will find the link to the webinar where we presented that research at the UBC Learning Circle, so that if anybody's interested in that research, you can go and have a look at it. The second thing that I think is really important, and I didn't start by saying thanks for showing up. Like, so grateful that you're here and are curious about what these questions are and are interested in learning more, so that presumably you can respond to them in as good a way as possible. So thanks. Masicho Marci. And the other thing that just occurred to me as you were providing those examples, Kirsten, is that I think one of the very sneaky ways that systemic white supremacy and Indigenous specific racism stay like firmly woven into our ways of working is through this hesitance and apprehension to lean into the work. And that, I think, is driven sometimes by feeling like, oh, I don't know if I know enough. Oh my gosh, I don't even know how to do the work. In that previous recommendation, it was like pretty big, and it was like, oh, OPHO and FNHA and MNBC and Province of BC need to come together and do this work. Well, if we waited as the Office of the PHO for that group to get convened to participate and contribute, we'd be waiting a really long time because, things move slowly. And so we decided to look at ourselves and say, okay, what can we be doing so that when that table does come together, we have something to contribute, or we can be catalyzing conversation as we go. And our goal is never to be perfect. So if you're here because you want to learn how to do it perfectly and not make a mistake, well, unfortunately, we can't tell you how to do that because this work is messy and it is imperfect. And we go back to those frameworks because we have been told that we need to name and ask and learn and understand in these imperfect ways so that we can act in ways, again, that are probably imperfect, but at least are creating momentum and at least starting to hardwire this orientation and this practice into our everyday work. So I just wanted to say that because sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating and thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure that I'm going to do this right. Don't worry, just doing it creates the momentum where then you can course correct and continue to strengthen and get better and better. That's it.
Awesome. And I think we were going to stop recording here potentially, Carly.